Hello my beautiful souls, welcome back to my channel. I am the City Witch and today we're going to be reviewing The Book of Ancestors by Claire Goodchild, a guide to magic rituals and your family history. So as always, I have read the book from cover to cover. I have made myself a little list of all the positives and negatives. I will score the book from 1 to 10 and let you know if it made it into my magical library or not. And the hope is that by doing these book reviews and showing you the inside of the book, walking through the contents, the chapters, and all the various different positives and negatives, you can make your mind up if this is the right book for you or not, thus saving you time, money, and energy. So let's dive into this book. So as I said, this book is about ancestor veneration, working with your ancestors magically and incorporating ancestors into your journey of life. So if that sounds interesting to you, then this very well might be the right book for you. Let's take a look at the back of the book. A beautiful and mysterious guide to communing with ancestors for personal growth, the healing of trauma, and powerful daily magic. The dead are our constant companions. Our ancestors travel with us as potential guides, healers, and teachers if we are willing to listen. To understand who we are and how to become who we want to be, we must first understand where we came from. The Book of Ancestors provides a map for seekers who want to develop relationships with those who came before. Ancestor work can give us answers to lifelong questions and help connect the dots of our own family history. And when we welcome our ancestors into our lives through magic and ritual, they can help us heal and grow. Here, Claire Goodchild guides those new to ancestor work on their journeys. She also supplies rituals, spells, and crafts from her personal practice, as well as from fellow witches for a broader lens. With this toolkit, you'll feel empowered to form lasting relationships with those who came before. Okay, let's have a little look inside the book. So one of the things I did really enjoy about this book is it is a hardback and it is full colour, and we have these beautiful images inside this book which Claire drew and designed herself. Claire also has a oracle and tarot deck that feature these beautiful pieces of art. So if that sounds interesting to you, they might be excellent tools to help you connect further with your ancestors. I don't own her tarot deck, and honestly the tarot did not appeal to me personally. I actually have other decks that I prefer for working with my ancestors. However, I did purchase her oracle deck that I felt was more flexible and something that I could use for various different things, and I ended up using it with my ancestors, and it's a deck that I have thoroughly enjoyed working with. So while the tarot wasn't for me, the oracle absolutely was. So definitely go ahead and check those out, guys. So the contents of the book, we start with an introduction that just highlights what the book is for, how to use it, and talks to you about the various different topics that you will encounter inside this book. And Claire kind of introduces herself to you. Then we have 10 chapters, and they are as follows. Chapter 1, Who are the Ancestors? Chapter 2, Ancestor Grimoire. Chapter 3, Working with your Ancestors. Chapter 4, Ancestor Altar and Offerings. Chapter 5, The Family Tree. Chapter 6, Ancestor Research. Chapter 7, Heirlooms and Keepsakes. Chapter 8, Burials and Funeral Customs. Chapter 9, A Guide to Cemeteries. And Chapter 10, Planning Your Death. Then we have some acknowledgements, resources, correspondences, and a full glossary at the end of the book. So Claire does an excellent job of introducing us to this topic of ancestor veneration. She talks about ancestors and breaks down the different terminologies. So spirits, ghosts, hauntings. She talks to you about blood ancestors and what she calls community ancestors. Commonly you will see in other books as beloved dead. So people that have passed over that weren't necessarily connected to you through marriage or blood relations, but you loved and adored them nonetheless, and they were important to your family and considered an extension of the family. Then we have archetypes, which is discussed, which is something I actually do like with ancestor veneration. So let's say, for example, one of your ancestors was a doctor, they would be considered a healer archetype. So if you wanted to do a healing spell, you could actually list all the people in your family tree, both blood related and in your community, that were a different type of healer, and you might want to work with them for a healing spell or ritual, or to make a healing charm, or call upon them to help somebody's recovery, or to ask for their protection for somebody who's going through surgery. So there are lots of different archetypes you can work with. She starts with the forgotten, then she talks about protectors, she talks about teachers, reapers, the thread spinners, and then she talks about the different correspondences associated with those archetypes. She doesn't give a full and complete list on honouring the archetypes and the different ones you can work with, so think outside the box a little bit. So like I said, I called upon healers in this example, but you can also think about mothers and fathers. What about builders and crafters? What about people who were scientific, you know? So break down the archetypes into ones that you're likely to work with in your craft and practice, and list all your ancestors underneath those archetypes. And then if you don't have any ancestors that were healers, you might just call upon the actual energy of ancestry and the spirit realm for that archetype of whatever it is you're looking for. So be it a doctor, a protector, you can call upon that energy in its basic form. You don't have to know the name of a specific ancestor to work with that energy, and that is something that she discusses in this book. Then we go into ancestor grimoires. So what is a grimoire, how to create one, and you can create more than one. So she talks about creating a grimoire for your blood relatives and then one for your community, which is excellent. And then she talks about a third one maybe for archetypes. She also talks about the difference between having a hardback copy and digital, how to organise it, and things you might want to include. So things like marriage records, family legends and folk tales, photos, recipes, records of any kind. She talks about creating individual ancestor profiles, church records, cemetery and burial or funeral records. Where did they live, so their neighbourhood, their country, what languages did they speak, law, mythology, religions. So all things that help build who that person was and things that are associated with you and your ancestry. So she gives you a book blessing, so cleansing it first of all, blessing it, creating ritual ink, additional steps you might want to consider. And then one of the more interesting things was creating an ancestor sigil that is unique to you and your bloodline. And one of the things she talks about is you might want a sigil that connects every body you've lost, so you know, an ancestor sigil in its entirety, or you might want to break it down to the 3 different types, so one for the community, one for your blood relations, and one for archetypes. You might want to create a sigil for your paternal and then one for your maternal bloodlines. So it's up to you, but I thought that was really interesting, creating sigils that are quite unique to you and your connection with your ancestors, and that is something I've started to do and I have enjoyed that process. She also talks about spells and rituals, the differences between a spell and ritual. And she gives you some ideas about why you might want to work spells and rituals with your ancestors. Then she goes straight into actually working with your ancestors. So here we see things like protecting yourself, a daily candle offering. That is something I've started doing since I read this book. So I actually bought myself a really large Yankee candle and I blessed it. I chose one with floral fragrances because all of my immediate family members that passed away were gardeners. They loved to be in the garden, planting flowers, and it was just something they appreciated. So I thought I'm going to go with something that reminds them of being in the garden, of, you know, planting plants, enjoying the flowers. So I chose a floral based Yankee candle, one of the largest ones. I drew my family sigil into the top. So this is what was recommended in this book, creating a sigil for your ancestors. I carved that into the top. I anointed with oils. I added in some ingredients, things like tobacco for my granddad, flower petals for my nans, and kind of just incorporated that into the candle to make it special to them. Placed it on their altar, and every day I light it for 1 hour to venerate and connect with my ancestors, and that has worked really well for me. So this was a great suggestion. Then she goes into talking about protecting yourself from certain ancestors that you may not want to work with. So say there's an ancestor that was quite volatile, that was a somebody who was abusive, maybe somebody that wouldn't agree with your lifestyle choices, somebody that was a horrible person, maybe abusive, nasty, critical, and you just don't want that energy in your space. How do you deal with that? So she actually talks to you about setting spiritual boundaries with your ancestors, letting them know what's okay and what isn't. I mean, you don't want your ancestors showing up when you're in the bath, for example, or when you've got guests over. So setting boundaries is very important when you work with your ancestors, and she teaches you how to do that, and she teaches you how to block out ancestors that you don't want to work with and you don't want to connect to. She also talks to you about the importance of grounding, the difference between internal and external protections. With external, she gives examples like the witch's bells, which will warn you when there's a spirit in your space and how to deal with that. How will your ancestors likely communicate with you? So we've got talking devices, divination, dreams, and then she gives you an example of different ways to incorporate those into your practice. Then we have crafting a spell for your ancestors and working with them, including your ancestors in your daily life. So when you're baking and cooking, candle making, reading and games. She talks about things that might have been important to your ancestors when they were alive. So voting, personal finances, languages, study and education. Then she covers the topic of ancestral trauma, and she breaks that down into 4 types: acute, chronic, complex and secondary, and how to identify those and then how to deal with them as well. Spiritual bypassing and trauma is also discussed in this book in great detail. And then your trauma support team, so therapists, psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, living support, and then ancestor support as well. She's got some fantastic exercises for calling your ancestors and the archetypes that you might want to work with, advice for certain types of practitioners. So these are practitioners that work with they want to work with their ancestors that have mental health problems such as bipolar disorder. How would you work with your ancestors knowing you have those conditions, and how to kind of navigate that? So that was great advice as well. Ancestor altar and offering, so how to build yourself an altar, things you might want to include, planning your altar, decorating it, making offerings. She gives you a cleansing floor wash to cleanse the space. She talks about magical timing with the moon phases, different incenses. She recommends using the broom as well in your practice. Here we have ancestor anchor suggestions. So these are things you can place on your altar that will link you to your ancestors. So things like some of their ashes if they were cremated, some of the dirt from their grave if they were buried, flowers that were important to them, something they used or wore on a regular basis in everyday life that you can place on your altar, photographs, things along those lines, and how to incorporate them into your magical practice. Also, if you come across an ancestor and they were not buried, she talks about creating symbolic graveyard dirt, and that was really interesting. So for that, she talks about gathering dirt from where they lived. So if you have a family house that they lived in their entire lives, their essence is in the dirt, their blood, sweat and tears is quite literally connected to that building. So you can connect that dirt, and then she gives you a whole ritual to make that sacred and turn it into symbolic graveyard dirt that you can place on your altar. And that was really interesting and insightful and a beautiful idea in my opinion. Then she gives you a few charms. So, there's a red thread charm that she gives you. There's some extra suggestions for things you might want to include on your altar that you may not have considered, such as flags for nationality, flowers and plants, charms and figurines, skeletons, poppets that you can create, mini urns and mini headstones that you can make if you're creative, and specialised objects. The family tree is the next chapter. So here she talks about creating a family tree for your ancestors, one for your community and one for archetypes. And she gives you examples of what that might look like, what you might want to include information-wise. She talks about names as well. So this was interesting. So why names are important. And she gives you different traditions around the world for that. So English naming tradition, Nigerian, we've got Jewish, Icelandic, Afghanistan, Chinese. Then she goes into DNA testing and blood types. She talks about why that's important and why you might want to get your DNA test done. And with that, she talks about the ethics of it. She talks about ethnicity versus culture. She talks about the pros and cons of getting your DNA done and the different places that do that. So Ancestry.com do a blood test, and so does 23andMe, and they're the two main ones. And she talks about the differences and pros and cons of getting them done through those websites as well. And then understanding your DNA matches when you've had your DNA test done. How are matches determined? Examples of that. DNA outside of immediate family and what to consider. Then we go into researching your ancestors. So here she talks about different tips and concepts and ideas, rituals and offerings, record keeping, enlisting the living, and questions you might want to ask your living relatives for identifying certain pieces of information that are important to you in your practice and your ancestor veneration. So death certificates and records. She talks about cemeteries, graveyards and funeral home records, oddities and death notices, funeral programs and memorial cards, church and parish records, coroner and autopsy records, wills and probates, birth records, marriage certificates, christening and baptism, consensus, divorce, immigration and travel records, school records, military records, occupational records, and any other resources to consider, such as newspapers, photos and albums, diaries, journals and letters. So there's a ton of information there. Then she talks about what happens if you've hit a brick wall and you can't find some of this information out. So she says, try alternative spellings to the name that you know they were called. She talks about broadening your birth and death dates. No records for enslaved people. So, you know, if you know your ancestor was enslaved, but you can't find a record of that, what else can you do? How can you discover more about that? No records for immigration and First Nations people. Where can you go to get that information? Who might have that information? How could you find that out? Poverty, addiction and homelessness, and how that might impact your research and your records. And then she provides a ritual called Write Your Own Eulogy. So if you come across an ancestor who didn't get a proper burial, or somebody you particularly want to honour that you don't feel was buried in a respectful way, you might want to write your own eulogy for them. And I thought that was beautiful, conducting a ceremony that's basically a burial rite and a way to let go and release them and honour them. So that was beautiful. Acts of service, so photo sharing in blogs, and by doing that you might find some lost relatives and connect with them. And that's something she talks about with DNA testing as well, that if you choose to do that on websites like Ancestry.com, you can actually upload the information of your DNA and blood tests, and if anyone else has done that and you have markers that are the same, it will automatically share that person's profile with you, so you can actually see that they are connected to you historically through your bloodline. So you can find lost ancestors and connect with family that you didn't even know you had. And I thought that was brilliant. Then we go on to heirlooms and keepsakes and the different mediums you might encounter. So paper, fabrics, jewellery. She talks about how to turn jewellery into talismans and amulets and into pendulums for your practice. Timepieces. Now, it was very common to receive a grandfather clock or a watch as a family heirloom. So what can you do with that? The history behind that and its significance. protective amulets, furniture, how you can incorporate furniture into your practice, pottery, china and crystals. Then we have using heirloom pottery, china and crystals in your magic, so as offerings, divination and altar decoration. Then we've got quilts and textiles. We've got using quilts and textiles for embroidery, making a witch's ladder out of it, altar cloths, and adding squares to a quilt that's been given to you so you can add to it over generations. Good luck charms. Then we've got recipes and cookbooks, and actually cooking the recipes that you are given and sharing that with your ancestors on their altar, which I thought was beautiful. Then we've got photos and photo albums, the importance of those and how to incorporate those on your altar. Heirlooms of connection. So here we talk about the magic of the mundane, so key charms that were often used by your ancestors that you've inherited. So house key, office key, car keys. We've got spoon charms. We've got a healing ritual here called the shovel healing ritual. What else have we got? The Screaming Skull of Burton Agnes Hall. So this is where she starts talking about haunted heirlooms. So what do you do if you've encountered a haunted heirloom and you've inherited that? So first of all, she talks about, well, what if you want it to stay haunted? How to actually employ that spirit in your favor. And then what if you want to get rid of that spirit attached to the item? What if it's quite nasty and you want to kind of cleanse the item? So she talks about setting boundaries. She talks about trying to dampen or suppress the energy, or flat out just remove the energy. And if none of that works, getting rid of the object if it's really getting under your skin, if it's really impacting your craft and practice. So burials and funeral customs, this was also very interesting. So casket versus the coffin, cremations, burials, and we've got the traditions surrounding that, different types of caskets and coffins. Then we've got a few different traditions. So we've got Western funerals, we've got Hindu, we've got Chinese, and again we've got an idea of all the different urns there. Then we've got a guide to cemeteries, and this was probably one of my favourite chapters. This one talks about the do's and don'ts of approaching a cemetery or a graveyard, history and terminology. We've got what can be found at a cemetery, what to expect. Then she breaks down the different types of graves you may see. So a regular grave, a plot, a gravestone, headstone, footstone, tombstone, family stone, ledger stone. We've got grave house, we've got grave fence, tomb, mausoleums. And then the anatomy of a gravestone, so how to look at a gravestone and know what you're looking at. And this was really interesting, guys. Here she actually breaks down the materials that gravestones were typically made out of and in what time period, which actually will help you identify how old that grave is and when likely that person lived, if the dates have been, you know, over time and through weather have been worn off. So that was really interesting. So for example, limestone was between the 1650 and 1900s. And then she talks about shapes of gravestones, materials and markers, design a mini gravestone. This was something I did, and she talks about actually making them yourself out of paper mache and cardboard and things like that. But I actually realized you can buy little kind of headstones made out of crystal. So I actually bought one made out of obsidian and one made out of smoky quartz. And what I did was I took myself a Sharpie pen and I drew the initials of my ancestor on that, and then a symbol that I connected with them. So for example, my granddad had been in the war, so I drew a little what was it called? Medal. That was the word I was looking for. I drew a little symbol of a medal on there to remind me he had been to war and that he had protected us, and that he obviously was a protection guardian. But that's just one example of what you can do. You could choose to draw a sigil, you could choose to maybe glue a picture of your ancestor on that gravestone. It's up to you, but I really liked the idea of that. And when I did my research and found you could buy little crystals carved as headstones and gravestones, I decided to buy a couple of those and use those on my altar. So additional ideas: safety and spiritual protection. So physical safety versus spiritual safety, and why you need to incorporate both in your practice. Human spirits of the cemetery, cemetery guardians, and how to approach the cemetery guardian with respect, what offerings you might leave, prompts and ideas surrounding that. Grave offerings. She does talk to you about she reminds you that when you go to a graveyard or a cemetery, they might have their own rules and regulations, so kind of just talk to them about what you are allowed to leave and take, and then also look up laws in your own country as well, because some countries absolutely encourage leaving candles at a grave site, but then others don't like candles at all. So just do a little bit of research and your due diligence. Then we go into things like leaving flowers at the grave and then taking them away, and what you can do with flowers that have been charged at a grave site. She talks about rocks and gemstones and crystals, leaving money offerings, shells. She talks about personalized offerings, and then time, so just giving your time to the grave to clean it, maintain it, things like that. Water and snacks, gloves. She talks about all the things you might need if you're going to go to the grave and you want to harvest from it. So, you know, making sure you have gloves to protect your hands, water and snacks if you're going to be there for a long time, wearing the proper footwear, taking plastic bags, soft bristle brushes as opposed to hard, and a small spade. Making sure that you have offerings, maps and rules, a notebook and pen, mirror and flashlight, divination tools, spiritual protection, and EVP recorder in case you pick up the spirit communicating with you. Then we have seasonal cleanup, so maintaining the grave and your altar. Headstone symbolism. This was one of my favorites, guys. So one of the things I've been asking myself for a long time, and this is something that comes up a lot in baneful magic books, when they're telling you to go to a grave and collect the dirt of, say, a thief or a murderer. And it's like, but how would you know they were a thief or a murderer? Because it doesn't exactly tell you that on the headstone. So one of the things that Claire discovered was most headstones actually have a symbol carved into them that helps you identify a little bit about the person when they were alive. So, for example, let's see, clove. When in the three-leaf formation known as the shamrock, the clove represents the Holy Trinity as well as Irish identity. A four-leaf clover symbolises someone who was lucky or blessed in life. So that's kind of telling you if it's a three-leaf, they might have been Irish. So she gives you an example of plants symbolism that might be on the grave. She talks about animals. So if a dog was on there, so like a cat, a dog on a headstone is often reserved for someone cherished and displaying their love for animals, but can also be a symbol of loyalty, devotion, and friendly personality. Then we've got objects. So what does it mean if you see an arrow on a gravestone? The arrow is a symbol of the death archetype. While most of us picture the Grim Reaper with a scythe, he also sometimes pierces people with arrows of death. So there you go. So she gives you a ton of different symbols, ideas. She talks about things like the Star of David. She talks about symbols that might be on urns as well. Human symbols, so angel, death's head, father time, the green man, the grim reaper, hands, hearts on gravestones, and what all of those might have symbolized. Then she talks about secret organizations, so the Freemasons, Independent Order of Odd Fellows, American Legion, and Royal Canadian Legion, and what the symbols of those would be and how to identify them if you did actually see them on a gravestone. So very, very interesting. Research mode, how to research these things, cross-reference and check the information that you think you've discovered. Then she goes into planning your own death, and I don't want to be morbid here, guys, but she does make an excellent point of why it's important to plan your own death. Not only does it help others know how you want to be honoured, it also points out different things that were important to you and how you want to be remembered. And also, by planning your own funeral and putting some money to one side, it helps your family, especially if they can't afford to pay for your funeral, and it helps you have the type of funeral you would have wanted as well. So there's some really interesting ideas in here. So funeral versus a burial, high budget versus a low budget. Do you want flowers, choosing an urn if you want to be cremated, a letter to your descendants and leaving that in your book of ancestors, and how you might want to be added to that book. So you can also put yourself as a profile inside your ancestor book, so that when that book is passed down, there's stuff about you in there and people can add to it, which I thought was a lovely suggestion. So the Book of Ancestors, what were my thoughts? Positives. This is by far the best book about ancestors that I have read. Claire approaches this topic with enthusiasm, providing plenty of ideas on how to get started with working with your ancestors and how to research them thoroughly. One topic unique to this book was about the different types of funeral traditions for different cultures. Claire explains the differences and religious factors while remaining very respectful, which is something I appreciated. Claire provides some fantastic ideas for creating an ancestor altar. I love the idea of decorating the altar with homemade gravestones. If you don't have any photos of your ancestors, I found you could buy crystal gravestones, which is something I've already mentioned. So I actually did buy a smoky quartz one and a black obsidian one. And then I used a silver and gold Sharpie pen to write the names on the little mini gravestones of my ancestors, and in some cases I actually did that with their initials if I wasn't sure what the correct spelling of their name was. You can actually wipe that off with soapy warm water after, so if you want to cleanse that gravestone and reuse it for somebody else, you could easily do that. So I thought that was a really clever creative idea, and I kind of took it a one step further in a way that worked for me, because while I am creative, I don't think I could have made a really nice gravestone that would have honoured my ancestors. It probably would have looked like a hot mess, guys. So I chose to purchase crystal versions and instead get creative in my own way. So there's an idea for you. Claire suggests getting DNA tests done, which will reveal where you are from. I thought this was a fab idea, and one that I do plan to do in the future. This will reveal what is in your bloodline, which will help you when researching your ancestors. Claire provides excellent resources for tracking down your ancestors and entire lists of things to consider. She includes websites, lists of places that you can go to collect documents and information and deeds. Many websites have their own DNA tests that you can purchase, as previously discussed. And when the results are with you, you can choose to upload them and connect to lost relatives should you choose. And that was one of the things that I really appreciated her talking about in this book, because that fascinates me. I mean, I know I have family in Scotland from my granddad's side, but I've long since lost touch with them, and so's he, and connecting with them would be absolutely fantastic, and then I could go and visit them. Another unique topic that Claire discusses is all about how to identify someone's profession using their gravestone. Claire provides a long list of commonly used symbols that are carved into gravestones that represent that person's profession, as well as how to tell when and how they died. Handy to know for any witch out there who wants to work with graveyard spirits and collect graveyard dirt, which knowing this information for your craft and practice is very important. And this is the first book I've ever found that discusses that and teaches you that bit of knowledge. So it's worth its weight in gold just for that alone, guys. I enjoyed Claire's personal stories throughout the book and how she honours her ancestors, such as reading them stories and the newspaper in the morning, reciting poetry to them, cleaning and maintaining their grave sites, turning antiques and heirlooms and jewellery into protective charms and enchanting them for magical use. My favourite idea from Claire's book was to petition your ancestors by placing letters letters, requests, or questions behind their photo inside the photo frame that you keep on your altar, making it a private and personal contract or agreement or employment between you and your ancestor. Old furniture such as tables and chairs can be turned into lovely altars. If you've been given pieces of wood, say from their beloved boat, you could turn it into a shelf and place your ancestor veneration altar on top of that shelf. You can repurpose a lot of wood and include it in your practice, and there were some fantastic ideas in this book for that. And honestly, overall, this book was probably my favourite book on ancestor veneration that I have ever read. Now for the negatives, and there was only really one negative. Claire didn't talk about the subject of reincarnation. This seems to be a topic that is avoided by nearly every book on ancestors that I have read. I would have loved to have heard Claire's thoughts on the subject and have had a section in this book on reincarnation. Since she doesn't really mention reincarnation much in the book, I mean, it's touched on ever so slightly with different cultures and beliefs, but it's not a full topic. I would have appreciated her giving us a full chapter and kind of rounding this book off with talking about reincarnation, talking about life and death and the cycle of life. I think that would have been a nice way to finish this book. But alas, we didn't get that in this book, and for me that was a negative, and that is why I've decided to score the book 9 out of 10. Had it have included reincarnation as a full subject and topic, I would have given it a 10 out of 10. But yet again, this seems to be a subject that is highly avoided for some reason, and I don't know why. But Claire was such a fantastic writer. Her book was brilliant, well presented. It was whimsical, it was fun, it was enjoyable, it was respectful. It was one of those books that I would read over and over and over. And for any beginner out there wanting to connect with their ancestors, this is the best book for that. But like I said, had it have included the topic of reincarnation, I would have given it a 10 out of 10. So 9 out of 10 it is, guys. This absolutely has made it into my magical library and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But let me know your thoughts, and if there's anything you want me to highlight or discuss, please let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Please just leave a comment on the video. So thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed my book review and that you got a lot out of it. If you did, click the bell, give me a thumbs up, and YouTube will tell you when my next video comes out. And if you'd like to support my channel, you can do that through my Amazon wishlist or my PayPal link. And thank you so much for your help, your support and your guidance so that I can improve my video content. And as always, guys, take care of yourselves and I'll see you soon. Blessed be.